We're talking today about the phenomenon of civil war, or what is otherwise sometimes be referred to as intrastate war, in contrast with interstate war, war within states as opposed to war between states. In a sense, if we are thinking about basic definitions, a civil war might be a conflict in which the state monopoly of violence is significantly challenged, and where organized groups within a territory compete violently with each other. In the most extreme cases, the central state loses such legitimacy and control as to be unable to carry out the most basic functions of governance. This has led to the label of the failed state, which is not necessarily a always very neat category, but is an indication of the severity of breakdown in the monopoly of violence and latent conflict. Now, civil wars, of course, are not a new phenomenon, but they can be quite challenging to delineate, since the very distinction between interstate and intrastate wars is really only intelligible in a world of pre-existing states. In earlier periods, such as the European Middle Ages, where there were overlapping jurisdictions, a much wider distribution of armed force, violence was generally diffuse and persistent. We've talked about this in the session on the rise of the state. Prior to the rise of the nation state and the Westphalian system, unique, exclusive controls or monopolies of force were rare. In that kind of context, really all war is just war. Well, some wars are perhaps more just than others, and that refers back to the general strand of ethical thinking about what makes a war just or not. But this is by reference. Recall again the session on humanizing war. A war is deemed just because it corresponds to certain normative ethical principles. It isn't just or legitimate because of the identity of the belligerents. This is one of the things that emerges with the Westphalian state system, the idea that war is only something that state actors can wage, and any actor that is not a state is therefore illegitimate and must be conducting something else, some other form of conflict or war or insurgency and so forth. So when we talk about civil wars, in a way we are returning back to or we are departing from the state framing of conflict, and it is a category that only can be distinguished meaningfully when we have as a referent this idea of interstate war. On that note, civil wars are typically bloody, brutal affairs in which many of the restraints and norms on the use of force between states do not apply. And again, this is not surprising and is really quite coherent with what we've just said, which is that the laws of war, which imperfectly, inconsistently, but nonetheless to some degree have constrained the behavior of states, involved some limits on the ways they use force, some respect for basic principles regarding the protection of civilians and treatment of prisoners of war, and so forth. All these laws are premised on the mutual recognition of states as legitimate entities. Other states recognize each other's citizens or combatants as legitimate and therefore can be afforded certain protections. But it's precisely such a legitimacy that is at stake in a civil war. Those who are seeking to overthrow an existing government will necessarily make the claim that that government is illegitimate. And conversely, a government that is fighting an insurgency will present that insurgency as criminal, as terrorist, as inherently illegitimate. So in these conditions of asymmetry, in these conditions where the fundamental legitimacy of the groups and the right of the groups to rule or even to contest for power is not accepted or is disputed, then there will be very little room for agreements about what kinds of behavior are permissible or not. Now, if the first half of the 20th century was dominated by major interstate wars, most evidently, of course, the First and the Second World War, this escalation of total war, thereafter it's been observed that there is a very striking decline in the occurrence of interstate war and a general increase in the frequency and duration of civil wars. According to one estimate, more than 80% of the wars which have taken place since 1945 have been intrastate wars. The Cold War period in particular saw an upsurge in intrastate conflicts within former colonial states, often tied into global ideological conflict between liberal democracy and communism. And of course, in the aftermath of the demise of European empires, what was left after that was very often fragile states that were poorly prepared for independence, were weak in terms of their internal legitimacy, and with local elites that generally needed to find support from the superpowers. And so these could very easily become the playground, if you want, for proxy conflicts between the superpowers. One side backing the insurgencies, one side backing established authorities, and so forth. Now, after the end of the Cold War, into the 1990s, commentators noted a spate of civil wars in Somalia, the Balkans, Afghanistan, Sierra Leone, Liberia, the Congo, or Sudan. And all of these generated a set of claims that a new kind of civil war was coming to the fore. That these conflicts, relative to those that had preceded them in the Cold War period, seemed to be lasting longer, to be more protracted and inconclusive than earlier conflicts. A central contention here was that earlier civil wars were driven by political and ideological motives, with the end goal of belligerents being to control the reins of government. Of course, when these wars were fought with, at least superficially, the claim to be of groups to be socialists or anti-communist, and therefore to have a strong political orientation, that it becomes quite easy to make that claim, even though it might be, in some sense, a questionable one. But for those who wanted to talk about these new civil wars, they contrasted them by those of the past by saying that these new civil wars were either entirely senseless, one commentator noting that these wars were really about nothing at all, or at best merely about greed, profit, or economic gains. In light of this, taking control of government became an accessory goal, sometimes foregone completely, and so these wars were seen to be devoid of politics or values, perhaps best understood as forms of criminality. Now, there are good reasons to be skeptical of such broad brush claims, as we shall see. Yet it is also true that we can gain from understanding the political economy of intrastate conflicts, particularly as long as we avoid thinking of motivations and incentives only in terms of a binary between the political and the economic. One of the most widely echoed formulations of this period is found in the claim by Mary Kaldor of an era of new wars. An even wider thesis, in fact, about the changing nature of war in the post-Cold War era. The claim of Kaldor is essentially that the new wars are to be differentiated from old wars in terms of three main factors. First of all, agency, that is to say, who fights, what type of belligerents are involved. Secondly, the ends of these conflicts. Why are these conflicts being contested? What are they about? And the means, how these conflicts are ultimately being fought, and what weapons or tactics, strategies are deployed. So taking these three categories, we could begin with that of agency. And here the claim is that old wars were wars waged by states, interstate wars, whereas new wars involve a range of state and non-state actors. In fact, one of their characteristics is that the lines between them are often blurred. State militaries, therefore, are only one of the forces in presence, and even when they are frequently irregularly paid, frequently divided between different commanders. They don't possess a unity of command that you would associate with a conventional state army. In addition to these state militaries, we have a motley of warring parties, various paramilitary groups and militias, some of which might be associated with government factions, others with opposing factions. We have self-defense units created as a means of protecting civilian populations from depredations. We have the presence potentially of foreign mercenaries, what's become known as private military companies. There might be the presence of foreign troops, whether mandated by regional or international organizations such as the UN, the NATO, the African Union, for instance, or whether they are there as merely at the service of a specific state actor with an interest in the conflict. Finally, the distinction is drawn between the old wars being organized around centralized national war economies. Again, the model of total war is a good one. And in contrast, the new war is one that is organized by a global, decentralized war economy. This relates as well, of course, to the question of ends. The old war is a politically and ideologically driven conflict. Once again, our friend Clausewitz provides a good template for this. War as an extension of policy or politics. The ways in which states conventionally are said to think about the use of force, with an idea that a conflict will be used in order to achieve a state of peace or non-conflict beyond it. In contrast, wars or new wars are motivated by a combination of politics of identity and predatory economic gain, with one of the strong claims being that the lines between crime and war become decisively blurred in this context. According to the formulation of David Keane, war in the new war context might be best thought of as the continuation of economics by the means. Very evident reference and contrast with the Clausewitzian dictum. Finally, we have the matter of means. Once again, Clausewitzian wars were centered on decisive battles in order to achieve a final outcome. New wars, in contrast, have few battles. Belligerents generally avoid those. And so, here again, there's also perhaps a contrast to be drawn between older and more contemporary civil wars. Because the old wars of the Cold War era did adopt similar guerrilla tactics as the new wars and did tend to avoid major battles as a consequence. But if they followed the Maoist model, based on Mao Zedong's conquest of China, guerrilla tactics were only a preliminary. They were a tactic to be deployed while the opposition, the insurgency, the revolutionaries were weak. They would be a means of building up popular support. And once a critical mass of support and resources had been attained, it would be necessary to make a bid for a seizure of power. And this often required a move towards conventional forces, attacks, direct attacks on government forces, some sort of decisive battle, or at least a capture of the capital. Instead, the new wars, we're told, tend towards an indecisive, indefinite, low-intensity state of conflict, simmering for years, if not decades, without major battles or decisive outcomes, without even the belligerents necessarily making a bid to bring the conflict to an end or to take political power. Now, when we say low-intensity conflict, this is really a description of the intensity of the fighting at any particular moment. But that doesn't mean that these very prolonged conflicts cannot be especially deadly. In fact, of course, they tend to be particularly lethal for civilians. It's estimated that they represent 80 to 90% of the fatalities in the new wars, directly from conflict, but often indirectly through disease and malnutrition that ensue from the economic breakdown or general failing of government services. And so if we look, for instance, at the war in the Congo, which is a particularly emblematic example, it's estimated that since 1998, around 5.4 million people have died, around 8% of the country's population. Another feature of new wars, we're told, are the prevalence of war crimes and serious human rights violations. The uses of torture, mutilation, systematic rape, and so forth. Finally, one of the recurrent features of many of these conflicts has been the use of child soldiers, very young combatants involved in these armed forces or armed groups, brought into them at a very young age, often plied with narcotics, and obviously this is scenes, images that have generally horrified public opinion in developed countries. Now here we should of course ask about the sustainability of this old-new distinction. It's a very stark contrast that is drawn by Kaldor and her similar-minded commentators. But a number of scholars have objected to this distinction and shown that when we look at specific new wars and specific old wars, in fact, these hard and fast distinctions appear to be quite exaggerated. And someone like Stathis Kalyvas proposes that really what has changed is the way in which we view civil wars, much more than the way civil wars have changed themselves. So for instance, that the Cold War in many ways overcoded, overdetermined the way in which many of these conflicts were seen. We tended to see them through an ideological prism because the world was caught in a bipolar ideological conflict, and that there was some involvement of these opposing superpowers in these conflicts. But in reality, on the ground, the situations was much more messy, and the motivations and the features of these conflicts in a number of ways also resemble contemporary new wars. So there's quite a lot that could be said about how satisfactory this new war distinction is, certainly if it's applied in a hard and fast fashion. But with this important caveat in mind, we can still gain from considering the claim that the post-Cold War landscape of war is one that has been shaped by globalization. And this is a point that Mary Kaldor does articulate. And certainly it would be a mistake to view conflict as the natural product of underdevelopment and disconnection with the global economy. Rather than being parts of the world left behind, what we find in many of the territories of contemporary civil wars, or new wars if we want to use the term, is that these countries are embedded in a form of globalization themselves, and that we cannot really understand the conflicts on the ground without paying attention to these global connections.